The courthouse in the small Midwestern town stood like a relic from another century, with its red brick walls, towering columns, and creaky wooden benches that seemed to carry the echoes of countless past trials. On this particular morning, however, the building held a tension thicker than usual. A case was about to be heard that had already divided the community, stirred painful emotions, and raised questions about whether justice could be served when the most important witness was a 3-year-old child. Inside the courtroom, sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that drifted in the heavy air. The judge's bench stood elevated, giving the room a sense of stern authority. Jurors filed in, some clutching notebooks, their expressions solemn. Family members, reporters, and curious locals crowded onto the benches, whispering in hushed tones. Everyone knew the stakes were unusually high. At the center of it all sat a tiny girl with wide, uncertain eyes and golden curls that framed her face like a halo. She clutched a tattered teddy bear in one arm, her other hand tightly gripping her mother's sleeve as they waited for the proceedings to begin. Was far too young to understand the full weight of the trial, but she understood fear. The courtroom, with its strangers, its pointed questions, and the looming figure of the man accused, was a place that seemed to swallow her courage whole. The accused sat just a few feet away at the defense table. He wore a suit that looked too crisp, as though the effort to appear respectable was meant to conceal something darker. His eyes darted occasionally toward the little girl, but mostly he maintained an unsettling calm. Some jurors avoided looking directly at him, while others studied his face, trying to reconcile the man before them with the charges that had shaken the town. The case had unfolded slowly, painfully. Allegations of abuse, whispered first among family members, had eventually reached law enforcement. The investigation had uncovered fragments of evidence, enough to justify charges but not enough to guarantee conviction. It all came down to her words, her courage, her ability to communicate what had happened. But asking a 3-year-old to testify was a monumental challenge. The prosecutor knew it, the defense knew it, and the judge, who had seen decades of trials, understood it most of all. Adding to the unusual nature of the case was the presence of Shadow, a large German shepherd with intelligent eyes and a calm demeanor. Shadow was not there as evidence, nor as a distraction. He was a specially trained police dog, certified to provide comfort to vulnerable witnesses, especially children. His presence was part of a growing practice in U.S. courtrooms, one that had sparked debate but also shown remarkable success in helping children find their voices amid intimidating legal settings. Shadow lay quietly on the floor near the witness stand, his chest rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. He wore no intimidating gear, only a vest that read "Support Dog" in neat lettering. For now, he looked almost invisible, his stillness blending into the background. But for who had met him briefly before the trial, his presence was like a silent promise of safety. The judge entered, calling the court to order. Chairs scraped as everyone stood, then sat again. The trial resumed with formalities, the reading of charges, the opening remarks of the attorneys. The prosecutor, a woman with a measured voice and kind eyes, stressed the importance of protecting the innocent and seeking truth even when it came in fragile forms. The defense countered, insisting that the case was built on weak evidence and the unreliable testimony of a toddler. To some in the audience, his words carried weight. To others, they felt dismissive, almost cruel. As the morning wore on, witnesses were called. Investigators who had interviewed family members, doctors who had examined for signs of harm, and a social worker who had worked tirelessly to prepare her for this day. Each with professionalism, but there was no avoiding the reality that the case rested almost entirely on whether could speak. Without her, the accusations might crumble under the defense's arguments. Finally, the moment arrived. The judge announced that the child would now be called to the stand. The room shifted, a wave of anticipation passing through everyone present. His mother knelt, whispering reassuring words in her daughter's ear. With hesitant steps, moved toward the witness stand, her teddy bear dangling from one arm. Her shoes tapped lightly on the wooden floor, each sound in the hushed silence. Shadow lifted his head as approached, his ears flicking slightly, his gaze steady and gentle. The bailiff helped climb into the witness chair, which seemed far too big for her small frame. The judge leaned forward, softening his usually stern tone as he addressed her. "Good morning," he said kindly. "Do you know why you're here today?" Hugged her teddy bear and said nothing. Her eyes darted toward the crowd, then to her mother, and finally down to the floor. The prosecutor stepped forward, her tone carefully gentle. "Hi, my name is Miss Carter. Remember, we talked before. I'm going to ask you some questions and you don't have to be scared. Just tell us what you know." But remained silent, her lips pressed into a thin line. The defense attorney smirked faintly, confident that this was proof enough of her unreliability. The jurors glanced at one another, some with pity, others with growing skepticism. The judge sighed quietly, already suspecting that the morning might end in frustration. For several long minutes, the courtroom sat in limbo. The prosecutor tried small, simple questions: name, her favorite color, even what kind of toy she liked to play with. Eyes flickered with recognition, but no sound came. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, peeking over the edge of the witness chair toward the floor where Shadow lay. The dog's head tilted ever so slightly, his dark eyes locking onto hers. His tail thumped once against the wood, a subtle acknowledgement. His grip on her teddy bear loosened just a little. The prosecutor noticed the shift and nodded subtly to the handler, who remained nearby. With a quiet signal, Shadow was allowed to move closer, padding softly across the floor until he sat beside the witness stand. His eyes followed him, her breathing slowing as she reached out one tiny hand to brush against his fur. The room watched in silence, jurors leaning forward, spectators holding their breath. Something invisible was happening in that moment, a bridge forming between a frightened child and the words locked inside her. The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably, sensing that the dog's presence might undo his advantage. But for now, the judge allowed it. After all, the goal was truth, and if a dog's calm companionship could unlock it, then so be it. And then, as the courtroom hung in fragile silence, pointed at Shadow, her little finger trembling. Her lips parted, and for the first time since entering the room, she spoke. Two tiny words, barely above a whisper, broke the heavy air. "Bad man." The words were so soft that some wondered if they had imagined them. But the prosecutor heard, the judge heard, the jurors heard, and in that instant the entire direction of the trial began to shift. The two words whispered "bad man" still echoed through the courtroom like a haunting bell. For a moment no one moved. The jurors sat frozen, the prosecutor blinked in disbelief, and even the judge seemed caught off guard by the sudden breakthrough. But almost as quickly as they came, his courage slipped away. She pressed her face into her teddy bear, her tiny shoulders shaking as the weight of so many eyes pressed down upon her. The prosecutor, Miss Carter, took a small step forward, careful not to startle her. She said gently, her voice a calming hum, "You're doing so well. Can you tell me what you meant when you said bad man?" His lips parted, but no sound came. She buried herself deeper into her bear's fur. Shadow, sensing her unease, leaned closer against the stand, his warm breath brushing her small hand. She let her fingers curl into his thick fur, grounding herself. The defense attorney, seized the pause with a sharp objection. "Your Honor," he said, rising swiftly, "this is highly improper. We are relying on the incoherent mumblings of a toddler who doesn't even understand what's happening here. This is dangerous ground." Judge, a man known for his patience, raised a hand to silence the room. His gaze shifted from the defense attorney back to the little girl. The harsh lines of his face softened, a rare glimpse of compassion showing through the robes of authority. "Mister, I will remind you that the court has made accommodations precisely because of his age. She may continue. Now sit down." The attorney pursed his lips but obeyed, returning to his seat with a flick of his jacket. The jurors glanced at one another, their eyes wide with the weight of what they had just heard. The seed of doubt that had tried to plant earlier, that was too young, too fragile, had been shaken. Even the softest voice when carrying the truth had power. Miss Carter crouched slightly, lowering herself to eye level. She said again, this time slower, "Is the bad man here today?" The room seemed to hold its breath. Peeked out from behind her teddy bear, her gaze sweeping hesitantly across the crowded benches. Her eyes darted from face to face, skipping over the strangers until at last they landed on the accused. Her hand, still resting on Shadow, tightened its grip on his fur. She lifted her arm, trembling but determined, and pointed at the man sitting at the defense table. Gasps erupted from the gallery. A few jurors shifted uncomfortably, while others leaned forward, their expressions hardening. The accused, who had sat smugly through much of the morning, clenched his jaw and lowered his eyes, as though suddenly aware of the room's full attention. The judge rapped his gavel once for order. "The gallery will remain silent. Proceed, Miss Carter." However, seemed to shrink after her bold gesture. She dropped her arm quickly and squeezed her teddy bear tight, retreating into herself. The courtroom's intensity was too much for her small frame to bear. For several painful minutes, she sat in silence, rocking slightly, as though willing herself to disappear. Miss Carter understood that pushing her too hard might break the fragile thread of courage had shown. She shifted her approach. She said softly, "Do you like dogs?" His head tilted slightly. She glanced at Shadow, then gave the smallest of nods. "Shadow likes you," Miss Carter continued. "He's here to help you feel safe. Can you give him a pat just like you did before?" With tentative fingers stroked the dog's fur again. Shadow remained perfectly still, his calmness radiating through her touch. The jurors watched, some with tears beginning to form, as the child and dog shared a moment of wordless communication. Encouraged, Miss Carter asked, "When you're with Shadow, do you feel a little braver?" Nodded again, her lips twitching as if to form words. But before she could speak, Mr. was on his feet once more. "Objection! This line of questioning is manipulative. Counsel is leading the witness by appealing to her affection for an animal. This is not testimony, it's theater." "Overruled," Judge replied firmly. His eyes flicked toward the defense attorney, irritation clear in his tone. "This child is entitled to every measure of support. If Shadow helps her, then Shadow stays. Sit down." The jurors shifted, some nodding almost imperceptibly in agreement. The defense attorney scowled but retreated once more. Miss Carter turned back to, "Sweetheart, can you tell us what the bad man did?" The question hung heavy in the air, pressed her cheek against her teddy bear. Her small fingers dug into its seams as though trying to squeeze the courage out of its worn fabric. The silence stretched on, the crowd shifting nervously. A few people in the back coughed quietly, while reporters scribbled furiously into their notebooks, sensing the gravity of the moment. Finally whispered something, so faint that only those nearest could hear. Miss Carter leaned closer. "I'm sorry, can you say that again?" His voice cracked, trembling under the weight of memory. "He hurt me." The words rippled through the room like a thunderclap. His mother stifled a sob, covering her mouth with her hands. One juror visibly flinched, while another scribbled furiously into her notebook, her face pale. Shadow pressed his body closer to, and she wrapped her arm around his neck as though clinging to a lifeline. Miss Carter took a steadying breath, her heart pounding in her chest. "You're very brave," she said softly. "Can you tell us how he hurt you?" But before could respond, her small face contorted, and she began to cry, quietly at first, then in shuddering sobs that filled the courtroom with raw pain. Shadow nuzzled against her, his calm presence steady, but the enormity of the setting had overwhelmed her once more. The judge raised a hand. "We will take a recess," he declared firmly. "This court will reconvene in 30 minutes. The gavel struck, and the room exploded into whispers as people filed out. Some shook their heads, some wept openly, and others muttered about the defense attorney's smirk, which had all but vanished. The accused sat stiffly, his composure slipping as the realization dawned. The child had spoken, and though her words were few, they carried a weight that could not be ignored. As the bailiff helped down from the witness stand, Shadow walked beside her, matching her every step. She clung to his fur with one hand and her teddy bear with the other. Her mother rushed to embrace her, whispering soothing words, but it was clear to everyone who had truly given the little girl the courage to speak that day. And as the jurors filed into the deliberation room for their brief break, one thing became clear in their hushed conversations. The silence that had hung over the trial for so long had finally been broken. His voice, fragile, trembling, yet undeniably real, was now part of the record, and no amount of objections or smirks from the defense could erase the image of a child pointing at the man accused and calling him exactly what she believed he was: a bad man. The trial was far from over. More testimony would follow, and the defense would fight tooth and nail to dismantle the child's words. But a shift had occurred, one that everyone in the room felt in their bones. The fragile silence had given way to the first cracks of truth, and though his voice might falter again, the presence of Shadow and the courage he inspired promised that this was only the beginning. The courtroom returned from recess with a tense energy that buzzed in the air like static before a storm. Whispers drifted through the gallery as people filed back to their seats. Some speculated whether would speak again. Others wondered if the judge would even allow her testimony to continue after such a painful display. Yet beneath the uncertainty lay something undeniable. The words she had already spoken, "bad man," and "he hurt me," could not be unsaid. Sat once more on the witness stand, her teddy bear clutched tight, her small legs swinging nervously. Her mother's reassuring smile from across the room helped, but eyes were drawn again and again to Shadow, who rested patiently at her side. The German shepherd's steady breathing seemed to calm her, reminding her that she was not alone in this vast, intimidating space. The prosecutor, Miss Carter, approached with deliberate gentleness. She knew the jury had been shaken, and she knew trust was fragile. Every word, every movement mattered. Kneeling to meet the girl's gaze, she asked softly, "Do you remember how you were brave before, when you told us about the bad man?" Nodded faintly, but no sound left her lips. Her eyes darted toward the accused. The man sat rigid, his jaw clenched, his gaze fixed somewhere on the table before him. He no longer looked smug. If anything, he looked cornered. "Do you think you can be brave again?" Miss Carter asked. Hesitated, burying her face in her teddy bear. For a moment, it seemed she might retreat again into silence. Then, almost instinctively, she turned to Shadow. Her tiny hand reached out and pressed against the dog's back. Shadow shifted just enough to lean into her touch, his body warm and steady. And then it happened, the gesture that would etch itself into the memory of every person in that courtroom. Lifted her hand, not toward her teddy bear, not toward her mother, but toward Shadow. She pointed at him with her small finger, then turned her gaze back toward the accused. Two words slipped from her lips, fragile yet piercing: "bad man." The silence that followed was absolute. It was as though the very air had been sucked out of the room. Jurors stiffened in their seats, their eyes wide. Reporters' pens scratched furiously across notepads. The gallery erupted in a collective gasp before the judge's gavel slammed down, demanding order. The accused shifted uncomfortably, his composure visibly unraveling. His lawyer, Mr., shot to his feet, his voice sharp. "Objection! This is meaningless." She's pointing at a dog. "This testimony is vague, unreliable." But before he could finish, spoke again, her voice a touch louder this time. She pointed first to Shadow, then to the accused, her eyes locked onto the man who had haunted her nightmares. "Bad man," she repeated, firmer now. It was no longer vague. It was clear. The gesture linked her sense of safety, the dog, to her recognition of danger, the accused. The prosecutor let the silence linger, allowing the weight of his words to settle into the hearts of the jurors. She didn't rush, didn't prod. She simply nodded, her eyes glistening. "Thank you, that was very brave." The defense attorney sputtered, grasping for words. "She's 3 years old, Your Honor, 3. She doesn't know what she's saying. This is theatrics." Judge's gavel struck again. "Mister, sit down. The jury will decide the weight of the testimony." The courtroom obeyed, but the ripple of emotion lingered. For many jurors, the image was seared into their minds. A child, trembling but determined, pointing at a dog for comfort, and then at the man she called bad. It was simple, unrefined testimony, but it carried a raw, undeniable authenticity. Leaned back against the witness chair, her breathing heavy. Her eyes flicked toward her mother, who was silently mouthing the words, "You're so brave." Then she turned back to Shadow, who remained still, his dark eyes fixed on her as if guarding her from everything else in the world. The prosecutor took a deep breath, her voice steady but charged with emotion. "Can you tell us why you said he's a bad man?" The child froze, her face twisting with the effort of memory. The courtroom braced itself. For several long seconds she said nothing. Then she clutched Shadow's fur, burying her face in his coat. Her voice was muffled, but it carried through the microphones. "He hurt me." The words, repeated now with more clarity, rolled through the room like a wave. Smother sobbed quietly, clutching a tissue as tears streamed down her face. One juror pressed a hand against her chest, visibly shaken. Another wiped at her eyes. Even the judge's usual stoicism cracked, his brow furrowing with the gravity of the moment. Miss Carter's own throat tightened, but she held her composure. "You are doing so well," she said gently. "You don't have to tell us everything right now, just whatever you can. Did he hurt you when you were at home?" Nodded. "Did he tell you not to tell anyone?" The girl's small voice came again, trembling but certain. "He said I'd get in trouble." Gasps spread across the gallery once more, followed by a flurry of scribbles from reporters. The jurors exchanged uneasy glances, their faces pale. Shadow shifted slightly, leaning against as if absorbing the heaviness of her words. She wrapped both arms around his neck, clinging to him for safety. To everyone watching, it was clear. The dog was not just present, he was vital. Without him, the testimony might never have come. Mr. tried once more to intervene. "Your Honor, I demand that this line of questioning be stricken from the record. We are basing an entire trial on the inconsistent mutterings of a child barely old enough to form complete sentences." But Judge had heard enough. He leveled a stern gaze at the defense attorney. "Mister, you will sit down and hold your objections. The child is speaking. This court will hear her." The defense attorney slumped into his chair, defeated for the moment. The accused's face had grown pale, his hands clasped tightly together as if bracing against a tide he could not control. The prosecutor smiled warmly "Thank you, sweetheart," she said. "You're very brave, you've helped us all understand." Leaned her cheek against Shadow's fur, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. She had given more than anyone could have asked of her, yet the trial was far from over. The judge called for another recess, allowing the child to leave the stand. As the bailiff lifted down, Shadow rose smoothly to his feet and walked beside her. The sight of the tiny girl holding onto the leash of the massive dog struck a chord deep within everyone present. Reporters later wrote that it was like watching courage in motion, the smallest hand holding onto the greatest source of strength. The jurors sat in silence as they filed out, the image of trembling finger and her two small words burned into their minds. Whatever the defense might argue, no one could erase what had been witnessed. The turning point had come, and it had arrived in the simplest, most unexpected way, through a child's gesture and the unwavering loyalty of a dog. And though the trial would continue, though arguments and evidence would be presented, many in that room already sensed what history would remember. Not the cross-examinations or the legal jargon, but the moment a 3-year-old girl, with a dog at her side, found the courage to point to the truth. The moment's trembling voice carried across the courtroom. It felt as though the walls themselves absorbed her words. "Bad man." 2 syllables, yet they landed with the weight of years of suspicion. hidden bruises, and unanswered questions. The judge, a seasoned man with decades of cases behind him, leaned forward slightly, his pen frozen above his notepad. Even he, hardened by experience, looked rattled. Jurors exchanged glances, some leaning in, others blinking rapidly as if trying to process what they had just heard. The prosecutor seized the moment, though careful not to overwhelm the child. In a soft, steady voice, she asked, "Sweetheart, can you tell us who the bad man is?" Gaze flickered nervously around the room. Her small hands clenched the fur on her teddy bear so tightly that her knuckles turned white. For a brief, tense pause, it seemed like she might retreat back into silence. But then Shadow, the German shepherd lying loyally near the witness stand, shifted slightly. He didn't bark or move dramatically, just a quiet adjustment, his calm amber eyes fixed gently on the child. Noticed. Her breathing steadied, and with a shaky exhale, she raised her hand and pointed toward the defense table. Her finger landed squarely on the accused. The room erupted in a wave of reactions. A juror gasped audibly. A woman in the gallery pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle a sob. His mother, seated on the far side of the courtroom, broke down in tears, her body trembling as years of bottled pain poured out in that moment of validation. The defense attorney leapt to his feet, his voice sharp and panicked. "Objection! Your Honor, this is highly prejudicial. The child is confused, she's far too young to." "Overruled," the judge interrupted, his tone stern and commanding. His gavel struck once, echoing like thunder. "The witness may continue." The prosecutor's expression hardened. She crouched slightly, bringing her face closer to his level. "Can you tell us, in your own words, what happened?" What followed was both heartbreaking and chilling. Didn't tell a long story. Her vocabulary was limited, her sentences fractured. But those fragments painted a picture more vivid and damning than any polished statement could. Hurts, scary nights, bad man, don't tell. Each word landed like a hammer on the collective conscience of the room. Jurors squirmed. The court reporter, usually stone-faced, paused for a second as her hands hovered over the keys, visibly shaken by what she was recording. The accused sat stiffly, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the child, as if glaring could undo what she was saying. But the more he glared, the more pressed herself closer to Shadow. The dog, trained for moments exactly like this, remained steady, his presence like a shield. Reached out, her tiny fingers brushing through his thick fur, and she found the strength to continue. She described in fragments moments that investigators had suspected but never had the courage to confirm. "Bad man, say don't talk, I cry, Shadow safe." Her words were broken, but the truth in them was undeniable. The prosecutor guided gently, asking no leading questions, only clarifying softly whence meaning needed light. Meanwhile, the defense attorney grew frantic. "Your Honor, this child's statements are incoherent. She's clearly been coached. This is hearsay, speculation." The judge shot him a look that silenced the protest. "Counselor, sit down." His tone left no room for debate. The jurors' eyes told the story. Some leaned forward, brows furrowed in concentration. Others simply looked devastated. A few wiped their eyes discreetly. For them, this wasn't a matter of whether words were admissible. It was whether their hearts could handle the truth spilling from her tiny mouth. And still wasn't finished. She turned her head toward the man at the defense table, pointed again, and said, louder this time, "Bad man." Her voice carried a new firmness, almost as though Shadow's unwavering strength was pouring into her. The accused shifted uncomfortably, his once cocky posture faltering. He fidgeted with his tie, leaned toward his attorney, and whispered furiously. But it was too late. The damage was done. Those two words had changed everything. A stillness swept through the courtroom. No one moved, no one breathed too loudly. In that charged silence, the weight of truth felt undeniable. The judge finally leaned back in his chair, his face grave but resolute. "This court," he said, his voice slow and deliberate, "has just witnessed a moment of profound courage. For the first time in months of hearings, the case felt less like a battle of lawyers and more like what it truly was: a fight for justice, with a 3-year-old girl and a faithful dog standing at the center. In the gallery, whispers began. Some murmured about the extraordinary bond between and Shadow. Others shook their heads at the accused, disgust painted across their faces. No one doubted anymore that something deeper, something raw and unfiltered, had just surfaced. The trial, once hanging on technicalities and legal jargon, had taken a turn no one could have predicted. The power of 2 words, spoken by a child too young to understand strategy but old enough to know pain, had tilted the entire balance. And as the court adjourned briefly to recover from the moment, every person in that room, judge, juror, lawyer, or bystander, knew they had just witnessed history unfold. The courtroom returned from recess with a heaviness that felt almost physical. Reporters adjusted their notepads, the jury filed back into place with guarded expressions, and the defense attorney paced like a caged animal. But all eyes, once again, were on the smallest person in the room. She sat clutching her teddy bear with one hand and gently stroking Shadow's fur with the other. Her cheeks were still flushed from earlier, but there was a noticeable change. She no longer looked like a terrified, cornered child. There was a glimmer of resolve, faint but unmistakable. The prosecutor approached cautiously, mindful not to overload the fragile little girl. She said softly, her voice filled with respect, "Can you tell us more about the bad man?" At first, hesitated, her lips pressing together as if weighing whether to retreat into silence. But then Shadow leaned ever so slightly against her, his quiet presence a reminder that she wasn't alone. With a deep breath, began to speak again. Her words were halting, sometimes barely audible, but each one carried the undeniable ring of lived truth. "He hurt me," she whispered. The room froze. No one coughed, no one shifted in their chair. Her voice was fragile, yet it landed like a hammer strike. The prosecutor asked gently, "How did he hurt you?" The defense attorney shot up instantly. "Objection," leading the witness and highly prejudicial. His voice cracked, betraying his own rising panic. "Overruled," the judge said firmly, his gavel tapping once. "Proceed carefully, counselor." His lower lip trembled. She pressed her face briefly into Shadow's fur, inhaling the comforting scent of the loyal dog. Then she spoke again, her words fragmented but piercing. "Scary nights. He said don't tell, he make me cry. I hurt here." Her small hand moved instinctively toward her arm, then her shoulder. Jurors shifted uncomfortably. One woman blinked back tears. Another juror clenched his fists, visibly struggling to remain composed. Each fragment uttered painted a vivid picture, not of confusion, but of trauma no child could invent. The prosecutor remained calm, giving long pauses, never rushing her. "You're doing so well," she encouraged. "You're very brave. Can you tell us, when you say bad man, who do you mean?" His gaze locked once more on the accused. She pointed at him, her hand trembling but steady enough to be understood. "Him," she said. The word rang like a bell, leaving no doubt. The accused shifted violently in his chair, muttering something under his breath to his attorney. His arrogance, once so palpable, now dripped with desperation. He tugged at his tie, leaned forward and glared daggers at the child, but didn't flinch. With Shadow's reassuring warmth beneath her fingertips, she held her ground. At that moment, Smother let out an audible sob from the gallery. She buried her face in her hands, overwhelmed by both sorrow and pride. She had watched her daughter break free of silence and shame in front of strangers, something she had never been able to do at home. For years she had carried suspicion, guilt, and unanswered questions. But now, at last, she was seeing the truth come alive in her daughter's words. The defense attorney tried desperately to recover ground. "Your Honor, this testimony is unreliable. She's 3 years old. She doesn't understand the gravity of what she's saying. She could be confusing nightmares with reality." The judge's gaze turned ice cold. "Counselor, the jury will decide what to make of her testimony. Sit down." As spoke more, the prosecutor asked careful, open-ended questions. And those answers were often broken into short phrases. Their meaning was clear. Nights filled with fear, repeated warnings to keep secrets, and the painful reality of a little girl who had carried too much for her age. "Bad man," she repeated, her voice trembling. "He said no one believed me, but Shadow believed me." The courtroom cracked. Jurors' eyes brimmed with tears. The judge's throat tightened visibly, though he kept his composure. Even the stenographer had to pause to wipe her eyes before resuming. The defense attorney looked around the room and knew the tide had turned. He shuffled through his papers furiously, looking for loopholes, inconsistencies, anything. But there was no way to erase the authenticity of broken but honest testimony. Children didn't invent trauma with such accuracy, and no lawyer could cross-examine the bond between a frightened child and a faithful dog. The prosecutor ended the testimony with one final question, her voice low, almost reverent. "Are you safe now?" For the first time, a small, shaky smile touched his lips. She hugged Shadow tightly and whispered, "Safe with Shadow." The jury's collective heart melted. In that single moment, the abstract weight of evidence became a living, breathing reality. This was no longer about court procedures or legal loopholes. This was about a child's safety, a child's voice, and a child's undeniable truth. When was gently escorted out of the courtroom, Shadow walking proudly beside her, the silence that followed was deafening. No one spoke. No one even shifted. Every person in that room knew they had just heard the raw, unfiltered truth from the only witness who mattered. The prosecutor sat down slowly, her expression both exhausted and determined. The judge leaned back, his face solemn, and the jury, pale, shaken but resolute, looked like they had already reached a silent verdict in their hearts. The truth had emerged, not in polished statements or lengthy speeches, but in the broken, brave words of a 3-year-old child and the steady presence of a police dog who had given her courage. The defense might still have arguments left to make, but everyone in that room understood. The case had shifted forever. Justice was no longer a possibility. It was becoming inevitable. The tension in the courtroom after his testimony was unbearable. Everyone could feel it, the jurors, the judge, the spectators, even the reporters scribbling furiously into their notepads. The prosecutor had quietly stepped back, allowing the judge to call a short recess, but the accused refused to leave his seat. He sat at the defense table with his arms crossed, his jaw grinding, his eyes darting in every direction except toward the jury box. The swagger he had carried for months was gone. Now he looked like a man cornered. When the session resumed, the prosecutor wasted no time. She rose to her feet and faced the jury directly. "Ladies and," she began, her voice measured, "you've just heard the words of a child too young to understand manipulation or strategy. A child who described experiences no one her age should ever endure. Her testimony may have been simple, but it was powerful because it was honest." She let the weight of those words settle before continuing, and her courage deserves justice. The defense attorney, clearly rattled, scrambled to recover. He stood up quickly, packing before the jury. "What you heard from was tragic, yes, but she's 3 years old. Children that age confuse dreams with reality, nightmares with memories. She pointed at my client because she saw others doing the same. This is nothing but suggestion, planted by investigators who were too eager to find a villain." His tone grew harsher with every sentence, his desperation bleeding through. But the jurors weren't buying it. Their expressions said everything. They weren't listening to the words as much as they were feeling the contrast, the raw vulnerability of versus the defensive bluster of a man fighting to save himself. The prosecutor stood again, this time with a stack of documents in hand. She presented hospital reports noting unexplained bruises, testimonies from neighbors who had heard late-night screams, and photographs investigators had taken when was first removed from the home. Each piece of evidence, when combined with halting words, created a damning picture. The accused squirmed in his chair, his once steady mask cracking further. He tugged at his collar, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. Every so often he would lean toward his attorney, hissing whispered protests that sounded more like threats than strategies. Then came the moment no one could have anticipated. The prosecutor asked for to briefly return, not to testify again, but to confirm something simple in front of the jury. The judge hesitated, weighing the risk of putting a traumatized child back on display. But when walked back and holding Shadow's leash, the courtroom seemed to transform. Her tiny presence, paired with the loyal dog's quiet strength, silenced any doubts. The prosecutor didn't ask complicated questions. She knelt down, looked gently in the eyes, and asked, "Do you know who hurt you?" Nodded, her eyes flickered toward Shadow as if drawing courage, then shifted to the accused. She raised her small hand and pointed once more. "Bad man," she said, this time with a clarity that was unmistakable. The accused snapped. He slammed his hand on the defense table, shouting, "She's lying. She's a stupid little kid. She doesn't know what she's talking about." The courtroom gasped. The outburst shattered what little composure he had left. His attorney grabbed his arm, hissing for him to sit down, but the damage was already done. The jury had seen the mask fall. They had witnessed the anger bubbling beneath his false calm. The judge's gavel thundered. "Order in the court! Order!" His voice boomed across the room, his eyes blazing. "One more outburst like that and you'll be held in contempt." Flinched at the noise, but Shadow pressed closer to her leg, grounding her. The prosecutor quickly reassured the little girl, then respectfully requested that be excused from the stand. The judge agreed, his expression softening as he looked at the child. "You've been very brave, young lady. You may go now." As walked out, the jury's eyes followed her. Some jurors' expressions hardened with resolve, others softened with compassion, but all carried the same unspoken understanding. They had just witnessed the truth. The defense attorney tried desperately to regain ground. He called character witnesses who painted the accused as a good neighbor and helpful man. But their words rang hollow after his testimony and his explosive outburst. Then, under cross-examination, one witness admitted he hadn't seen the accused around the child in months. Another faltered when asked whether they could explain the bruises. The defense's carefully constructed narrative crumbled piece by piece. The prosecutor, sensing momentum, pressed harder. She brought in a child psychologist who explained how therapy dogs like Shadow help children express themselves in ways they otherwise couldn't. His testimony wasn't rehearsed, the psychologist. Her connection with Shadow gave her the confidence to speak, but the details came directly from her memory. That authenticity cannot be faked. By this point, the accused had lost control entirely. He muttered under his breath, glared openly at the jury, and at one point even shoved his chair back so hard it scraped loudly against the floor. Every gesture reinforced the image of a man with a volatile temper, the kind of man a frightened little girl might describe as a bad man. The breaking point came late in the afternoon. The prosecutor replayed a recording from one of the initial police interviews, where, much younger and still barely able to form sentences, had whispered almost the same words she spoke in court. "Bad man hurt me." When the audio filled the room, the accused buried his face in his hands, his shoulders heaving with frustration. For the jury, that was it. There was no longer room for doubt. The testimony, the evidence, the outburst, it all formed a single, undeniable truth. The accused wasn't a victim of a misunderstanding. He was the predator had bravely named. The judge called another recess, but the courtroom buzzed with hushed conversations and emotional reactions. Reporters scribbled furiously, already preparing headlines about the tiny witness and her canine guardian. Jurors avoided eye contact with one another, careful not to reveal their thoughts too soon, but their expressions betrayed them. They were shaken, furious, and determined. By the end of the day, the accused sat slumped at the defense table, his arrogance gone, his fate practically sealed. 2 words had pierced through every excuse, every legal maneuver, every attempt to silence her. The breaking point had come, and nothing could reverse it. The trial was no longer about whether the jury believed. It was about how quickly they would deliver the justice she, and countless others like her, deserved. The courthouse was packed when the jury finally returned. Word of the extraordinary testimony had spread, drawing in more spectators, reporters, and even advocacy groups who sensed the case was about to set a precedent. Every seat in the gallery was filled. Even the hallways outside buzzed with anticipation. Yet inside the courtroom, silence reigned. The air was so thick with tension that even the sound of shuffling papers seemed intrusive. Was not in the room this time. She had been escorted home with her mother, Shadow trotting faithfully at her side. The judge had insisted she be spared the final, grueling hours of the trial. Still, her presence lingered like an echo, each juror remembering her trembling finger, her whispered words, and the way Shadow had steadied her. The accused sat hunched at the defense table. His suit was wrinkled, his tie loosened, his once practiced smirk completely gone. He looked like a man who already knew what was coming but clung to a shred of hope that one juror might have doubted enough to save him. His attorney, pale and exhausted, shuffled his notes but barely glanced at his client. The two men weren't exchanging confident whispers anymore, just silence. "All rise for the jury," the bailiff called. Everyone stood as the jurors filed in. Their faces were solemn, their steps deliberate. They had deliberated for hours behind closed doors, but their expressions told the story before the verdict was even read. They weren't just making a legal decision, they were carrying the weight of a child's truth on their shoulders. The judge nodded toward the foreman. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreman, a middle-aged man with silver hair and weary eyes, stood. His voice was steady but heavy with emotion. "We have, Your Honor." "And what say you?" the judge asked, his gavel resting loosely in his hand. The foreman unfolded the paper in his hand, glanced once at the accused, then back to the judge. "On the charges of abuse and endangerment of a minor, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty on all counts." The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Gasps erupted from the gallery. Reporters scribbled frantically, some even breaking the courtroom's unwritten rules with quiet whispers into their recorders. One juror closed her eyes tightly, relief washing over her face. Another nodded, lips pressed together in grim satisfaction. At the defense table, the accused exploded. "This is a sham. She's a baby. She doesn't know anything." He tried to rise, but two bailiffs immediately stepped forward, pressing him firmly back into his chair. His face was red, his voice raw with fury. The judge slammed his gavel down with thunderous force. "Order, order in the court," he barked. "One more outburst and you will be removed." But the accused's protests no longer mattered. His words bounced off walls already echoing with the sound of the verdict. The jury had spoken, and their decision was final. The prosecutor sat back, her shoulders sagging in relief. It wasn't triumph she felt, but something deeper, an overwhelming gratitude that justice had prevailed in a case that so easily could have collapsed under doubt. She thought of how the little girl had whispered "bad man" while clutching Shadow's fur. That single act of courage had tipped the scales. The defense attorney dropped his head into his hands. For weeks he had fought tooth and nail, but now he looked defeated, even ashamed. He had argued passionately, but the truth had been undeniable. He packed his briefcase slowly, his motions heavy, as though weighed down by guilt. The judge turned to the jury. "Thank you for your service. This was not an easy case, but your duty was carried out with integrity and compassion. You are dismissed with the gratitude of this court." As the jurors filed out, many stole glances toward the empty witness stand where had once sat. Their faces showed a mix of exhaustion and admiration. They hadn't just listened to evidence, they had believed in the bravery of a child. Then the judge addressed the courtroom. His voice was steady, but emotion trembled just beneath the surface. "In my decades on this bench, I have presided over many cases. Few have struck me as deeply as this one. Today, justice was not won through the cleverness of attorneys or the intricacies of law, but through the courage of a child and the loyalty of a dog. Let this courtroom remember that truth can come from the smallest voices, if only we are willing to listen. The gallery erupted into applause before the bailiff could silence them. The judge allowed it for a moment, then raised his gavel for order once more. The accused was led out in handcuffs, his shoulders slumped, his face twisted in fury and fear. Cameras flashed as he was escorted away, the image of a man finally stripped of his false confidence. Outside the courthouse, the crowd waited for, when she finally appeared later that day, holding her mother's hand and Shadow's leash. The cheers were deafening. She didn't fully understand the significance of what had happened. She was too young. But she sensed that something good had come from her bravery. She smiled shyly, waving once before burying her face in Shadow's fur. For Smother, the moment was overwhelming. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered to reporters, "My daughter found her voice because of that dog. She couldn't do it alone. He gave her the courage she needed." The story spread across the nation that night. Headlines read, "Child's 2-word seal verdict," and "Police dog helps secure justice in landmark case." Advocates for children's rights praised the decision, pointing out how therapy and police dogs could transform the courtroom experience for vulnerable witnesses. Legislators even began discussing reforms to expand such programs. But beyond the headlines and policies, the verdict meant something simple yet profound. A little girl's truth had been heard, believed, and acted upon. She had faced her greatest fear, and in doing so, she had changed her future. In that courthouse, justice had not just been delivered, it had been redefined. The jury's verdict was more than a legal outcome. It was a message to every silent child, every overlooked victim, that their voices mattered, that even the smallest whisper could topple the loudest denial. And as was carried home, Shadow trotting proudly beside her, the nation began to understand what the courtroom had already learned. Sometimes justice doesn't roar. Sometimes it comes in the soft voice of a child who finally dares to speak. The courthouse steps were alive with energy that evening. Reporters swarmed outside, cameras flashing as they captured every possible angle of the historic verdict. Yet the true story wasn't about the man in handcuffs or the lawyers exchanging exhausted handshakes. It was about a little girl who had walked into a courtroom trembling, whispered 2 words, and walked out with her future restored. Only 3 years old, had changed everything. When left the courthouse holding Shadow's leash, she didn't understand the magnitude of what had just happened. For her, the trial wasn't about national headlines or legal precedents. It was about finally being safe. Her small hand clung tightly to her mother, and her other hand rested on Shadow's thick fur. Together, the 3 walked down the courthouse steps through a crowd that erupted into cheers. Smiled shyly at the noise, then buried her face into Shadow's side, overwhelmed by the attention. Shadow stood tall, ears perked, his demeanor calm and protective. To him, this wasn't about glory, it was about doing his job. Yet in that moment, he wasn't just a police dog, he was a symbol. Smother, tears streaming down her face, whispered to nearby reporters, "My daughter found her voice because of this dog. She couldn't have done it alone. Shadow gave her courage." Her words rippled through the crowd, striking something deep in every heart that heard them. News outlets across the country ran with the story. Headlines blared, 3-year-old girl's 2 words deliver justice, and police dog helps expose the truth. The story spread like wildfire, shared on television, radio, and social media. Millions were captivated, not just by the drama of the courtroom, but by the extraordinary bond between a child and a dog that made justice possible. Advocates for children's rights seized the moment. They began pushing for greater inclusion of therapy and police dogs in courtrooms nationwide. They argued that if a dog could help a child as young as face her fears and testify against her abuser, then countless other children could benefit too. Legislators listened. Committees began drafting proposals. What had started as a single case in a small-town courtroom was now sparking conversations that could reshape the justice system. For though the aftermath was quieter, more personal, She returned home with her mother and Shadow, stepping into a house that suddenly felt safer. The shadows that had haunted her nights began to fade little by little. There were still nightmares, still moments when she clutched her teddy bear too tightly, but the difference was clear. She no longer carried her burden alone. Shadow became more than just a courtroom dog. He was constant companion. At night, he lay at the foot of her bed, his presence reassuring her that no bad man would ever hurt her again. During the day, he followed her around the yard as she rediscovered the simple joys of childhood, playing in the grass, chasing bubbles, drawing pictures with crayons. Each laugh that bubbled from her lips was proof that healing was possible. Her mother, too, began to heal. The guilt she had carried for so long, the gnawing question of why she hadn't seen the signs sooner, slowly lifted. She threw herself into advocacy, determined to make sure no other parent or child would feel as alone as they once had. She began speaking at conferences, sharing story not as a tragedy but as a testament to resilience. "If my daughter can stand up and speak her truth at 3 years old," she told audiences, "then we have no excuse not to listen." The community around. Neighbors left flowers and cards at their doorstep. Local organizations raised funds for therapy programs and dog-assisted support services. Became a symbol of hope, not just for survivors of abuse, but for everyone who believed in the power of truth spoken from even the smallest voices. Months later, and Shadow were invited to a ceremony honoring their role in the trial. The police department awarded Shadow a medal for his extraordinary service. Dressed in a bright yellow dress, clapped excitedly as the ribbon was placed around Shadow's neck. She didn't fully understand what the medal meant, but she knew it was something special. She hugged Shadow tightly, whispering into his ear, "Good boy." The moment was broadcast nationwide, capturing hearts once again. Commentators described it as the image of justice, a little girl hugging her dog, both standing as living proof of courage and loyalty. In the years that followed, his case continued to inspire change. Courtrooms across the United States adopted new programs allowing therapy dogs to sit beside child witnesses. Studies showed that children spoke more freely and confidently when accompanied by a canine companion. Judges, prosecutors, and defense attorneys alike began to acknowledge the profound difference such programs could make. Grew older, and though she didn't remember every detail of the trial, she carried its lessons with her. She grew into a young woman with a deep empathy for others, particularly those who felt voiceless. She often said she wanted to work with animals when she grew up, perhaps even training dogs like Shadow to help other children. Her story was retold countless times in classrooms, training seminars, and advocacy campaigns. Each retelling carried the same message. Courage is not measured by size or age, but by the willingness to speak the truth when it matters most. For Smother, the most powerful part of the legacy was simpler than headlines or reforms. It was watching her daughter laugh again, watching her run freely in the yard with Shadow, watching her sleep peacefully at night. Those small victories were worth more than any legal triumph. The man who had once seemed untouchable now sat behind bars, his power stripped away, his name remembered not with fear but with condemnation. He had underestimated the voice of a child, and that miscalculation had cost him everything. But's voice had done more than convict a guilty man. It had opened the nation's eyes to the strength of children and the power of compassion. And at the heart of it all was a simple, unforgettable image. A 3-year-old girl, pointing to a police dog in a courtroom, uttering 2 small words that changed everything. The story would live on, not as a tale of tragedy, but as one of triumph. For Shadow, and for every child who had ever been silenced, it was proof that even the quietest voices could shake the foundations of justice. And so, as the sun set on that chapter of her life, his journey toward healing continued, not in silence but in strength. She had found her voice, and the world had listened.